All right, welcome, Alexandra. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, happy Friday. And so you are focused on eating disorders. You're a naturopath doctor as well.
Yes.
And your focus is on eating disorders, anything from anorexia to binge eating disorder to issues with food. And how did you get into this? Why is this an interest of yours clinically?
So before I even decided I wanted to be a naturopath, I kind of took a roundabout route. I never knew that I wanted to be a naturopath, and I actually did my undergrad in film and media. And for a lot of my life growing up, I had just different struggles with like depression and anxiety and eating and food as well. But I didn't really realize what was going on, and the people that I was seeing like never told me. So I'd go to the doctor and I didn't really understand. And then when I was in university, I ended up taking a year off, and I finally started seeing a therapist, and she actually worked with an ND, and she was like, you should see her because we work together. And it was the ND who was able to actually help me the most because of the way that she looked at like the whole person and the mind and body. One of the hardest things for me was always separating those two things, because what I would feel it everywhere, whether it was mentally, physically, whatever. And her approach to treating mental health and just like stress and different kinds of feelings, physical or mental, emotional, I so resonated with me. And she suggested that this was something I should maybe look at. And so I didn't even really know what I was getting myself into. All I saw was this end goal of how she was able to treat mental health through supporting the physical body and our nervous system. And that's kind of what brought me here. And so I've always wanted to treat mental health and eating disorders. I just feel, especially like it doesn't get the support that it needs. And even if you don't have an overt eating disorder, even just stress around food, it can be exhausting. And there's the resources out there. It doesn't really tell you how to get support, and there isn't enough options. And so that's where I really tried to focus my energy, because I feel like there's so much that we as naturopaths, as long as we understand what's going on and take the time to listen, can really do to support stress around food and different kind of eating disorders, and then what's going on underneath that as well.
It's so interesting that an ND was the one that really helped. Was it the ND that identified that there was a disordered eating pattern, or was that just someone who was helping in addition to the therapy?
She was in addition. So at that point, it had been diagnosed-ish.
Yeah.
And then she was just like an added resource for the kind of treatment that I was looking at the time. And then she ended up just being like the biggest guide for me in my own like recovery and healing.
Yeah. Was it the philosophy? I'm so curious about, was it like the structure, so the plan that she was offering, or was it more of the ND philosophy around food?
You know
Yeah.
what? I think it was less like, it was less about the food itself. It was the way she was able to look at me as a whole person and be like, you are so much more than what is happening right now. And yes, what's happening with food, and it's like the symptom, like a thing that's happening on a daily basis, but what else is going on? How is this impacting you physically? What are blockages both physically and mentally that are stopping you from being able to like transcend this pattern to heal and feel better? And it was that kind of ability for her to look at all of these different pieces, which I felt had never been looked at before, because in different types of treatment, and I'd tried multiple different ones, it was very much like this compartmentalized.
Right.
And I love therapy and also think it is so important, but there was times in my own journey where I wasn't able to talk about what was going on. It was really hard for me to like find the words to explain, because I didn't really understand what I was feeling or how that was even coming out in my life. And when So there was times where I was really, really overwhelmed by therapy.
Mm.
Whereas seeing my ND, there was never a time that I felt overwhelmed going in to see her. Like, no matter what was happening, no matter what I was feeling, whether I could talk about what I was feeling, whether or not, she always had resources for me, whether it was through acupuncture or like different kinds of body medicine, or just having like different supplements to help support what was going on, or even just her holding space and being there for me, and being able to kind of understand what was happening, and tell me that it was like everything I was feeling was okay.
Mm.
All of those different things, I felt like together was what I really needed, and what was able to help me the most.
Mm. That's so beautiful, actually, and really interesting, because yeah, it's like I'm hearing, yeah, you touch on like therapy. Again, I love therapy as well, but it seems like in a lot of the kinds of therapy that we're exposed to is usually talk therapy. There's almost this requirement for someone to respond or to participate in a really active way, like in a very verbal and intellectual way, right? If it's verbal therapy versus ND, like you can be like that, like you can go in and share your story and talk and get something off your chest, but you can also just show up. And I've had patients just cry on the acupuncture table, or some patients were like, I don't want acupuncture, I don't want to talk, I don't want you to give me supplements. And then we're like, okay, let's put some weighted bean bags on your legs and do acupressure. And they're like, thank you, that was great. So it's like this idea that we can respond and we have so many tools is really interesting. That could help someone, because when you're going through something deep, right? And again, you're also saying it's not just the surface level. I mean, it's not that an eating disorder is a surface level thing, but there was other stuff going on that this ND was able to access and offer me support for. And I was coming in like in various states, like sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's so great. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. That's really cool. It helps validate our medicine.
Yeah. And because sometimes what's happening for us mentally, emotionally, we feel physically.
Hmm.
And that's hard to talk about because it manifests in our body in ways that we can't explain, like mentally, emotionally, in talk therapy. We can only explain like the pain or whatever physical sensation it is.
Hmm.
And that's why I think gives us as MDs a really, really unique position in healthcare today, is because we have that knowledge of what's happening physiologically in the body, being able to understand if it is, like a medical condition, if it's something serious, if it's mental, emotional symptoms manifesting as physical symptoms, if it's like trauma in the body, whatever it is, we have tools to be able to distinguish and support all of those things at the same time, which I think is really, really important. And especially in eating disorders, when there is such a huge mental emotional component that manifests physically, sometimes in like literally being unable to digest food, which is unrelated to the food itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that is something that's very hard to distinguish for a lot of people, and very hard if you don't have an understanding of like that mind-body connection, or just of eating disorders as a whole. It's very hard to treat.
Mm-hmm.
You can go down a rabbit hole of like, what's wrong with your digestive system, blah, 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 when there isn't actually anything pathological going on digestively, but there's an imbalance in this mind and body connection, and a fear or intensity or panic or around food that is resulting in these physical symptoms.
Mm-hmm. And that's a good point, right? Because it's not always about body image, right? Sometimes it's just the body is not taking in food, and the person has trauma around ingesting the food because of how it's manifesting physically. And yeah, I think actually that's something I want to ask you, because I think even in the mental health realm, even in therapy, there's a lot of misconceptions about how we can like identify and treat eating disorders. And what were the biggest things you learned? And like now as a clinician who focuses on that, like what are you like, other doctors and other therapists need to know this about disordered eating?
So I think one of the most important things to know about disordered eating, even before like starting any treatment, is that being able to identify that there is some stress and disordered eating is really, really important um, before treating at all. Because a lot of times disordered eating patterns will come out in different ways. For example, someone being a vegan or a vegetarian or gluten-free or dairy-free, or having, bloating after every meal, or it'll come out in all of these different symptoms because that's so much easier to focus on than the stress around food. And so a lot of times, actually, practitioners, without realizing it, and it is not anyone's like fault, but they can perpetuate this cycle and actually make it worse, because that isn't like the actual underlying issue that's going on. And so I think one of the most important things is being able to decipher between when there is a dysfunctional thought pattern around food and when there isn't in a patient. And whether it's even just like overtly asking them and seeing what happens, or if you're unsure, like getting a second opinion. Because obviously this isn't everyone, and a lot of people have, digestive dysfunction and different things like that. But that, I think, is one of the biggest obstacles to supporting and treating eating disorders, is almost like the eating disorder kind of manipulates. And so it can also manipulate like doctors and practitioners.
Right.
And so you kind of get two sides. And the other thing in like eating disorder treatment is when you have the kind of opposite, whereas the treatment is so harsh, because the eating disorders are quite manipulative, like that eating disorder voice, and they convince us that, I am vegan because, like, there's all of these reasons that make sense as to why, vegan. To be vegan, or to make these diet changes, or that there's something really physically wrong because the eating disorder doesn't want to be found out. So you kind of get these two extremes where a lot of treatment is like very harsh, and there's no, it's very structured, and it's like, I don't care what the eating disorder voice is saying, this is what you're doing here, and here. And then the other is not realizing that there's an eating disorder and trying to kind of like placate that eating disorder voice. And both of those extremes will make the disorder worse, because it's not actually, neither of them are like looking at what's happening with the person, mental, emotionally, what these different eating disorder voices is saying, what's going on for them underneath those voices, what is happening physiologically in the body. Instead, they're focused on either like doing whatever the voice says, or doing everything the voice doesn't say.
Yeah, that's actually really eye-opening, because this idea of the eating disorder is its own entity that is manipulating everybody, the patient, the practitioners, the therapists. And I can think of so many cases where someone came into my office and they're like, I can't eat anything, I can't digest anything, and I'm looking for more. I'm already on the specific carbohydrate diet or the low FODMAP diet, and I need to take out more things. I need to figure out what thing is, now I want to go low histamine, and now I want to go gluten-free or keto. And you're like, we're combining like 10 restrictive diets, and we're ending up not being able to consume any food. But as a practitioner who's trying to heal the gut, you're working at that level. And it's really interesting to think that you could just be interacting with the eating disorder versus the actual patient and their needs, and as you're negotiating which other foods to take out, or how to figure out what other food is aggravating the gut, we're just in this dance with a disordered eating pattern. And how do you get below that? Is there a sense that you get, when someone's coming in? I know now that you put your shingle out, that's your focus, so people are going to come to you with the awareness that they have maybe some stress around food, or even a diagnosed eating disorder. But what was sort of alerting you to those things when you're working with a patient who was like, I'm on low FODMAP and I want to know what else to take out? Or
Yeah, so it can be challenging. I think for me, because I spent so much time, and I've done just like some other courses and interacting, and then I also have my own experience to kind of, I think it gives me a little bit of an easier time just to notice things and so sometimes I'll just ask more questions than would necessarily, always just to kind of check in with people, because whether or not there's a eating disorder or not, it's very, very common for us to have stress around food. There's so much information, expectation out there on how we're supposed to be eating, how your worth is tied to your food. And so it's always something that I'm checking in with people about, regardless of whether like there is an eating disorder there or not, because of the way it impacts our worth. But it is a harder thing, and often it comes with, as you see a patient more often, they'll start to be like more candid with you, and you'll start to learn about their different patterns. Part of like what I do with my patients is like a little bit of journaling, or they always have my email. So if something comes up in between, they can send an email. And I've had patients where when they're in like acute stress, send an email, and it has said almost the complete opposite of what that they said in the visit. And those are so eye-opening, because it's kind of an insight into what's going on underneath, like how they are feeling when they're not trying to hold it together and using food to cope and focusing on all of these other things. So a lot of it comes with like letting patients be vulnerable, and you creating just like a so non-judgmental space for them. And them just acknowledging their relationship with food in whatever capacity it is, whether it's like perfectly okay. And that can be an easy way to kind of start to get people thinking about it, or to open that conversation with every patient, regardless if there is an issue or not, but just in kind of an initial visit or in the visit, asking them like, what is your relationship with food? Like, how do you feel about it? Like, are you certain foods you don't like or you're scared of, like in a very non-judgmental and like normal way, because it is a normal thing that a lot of people talk about.
Yeah, especially as NDs, like food is such a pillar, right, of what people assume that we'll address, and then what we actually end up using to treat somebody's health conditions. So we're ultimately talking about food, or interacting with food in some way, and getting some insight into that relationship. Yeah, and you did mention before we started recording about stress around food and how to treat it is a big focus. Because I want to actually, maybe we can talk about, like you said that in your practice, you're not so involved in the refeeding, like, really severe anorexia where there's very low body weight, and then it's a very sort of clinical treatment where we're worried about refeeding and cardiovascular health and like these more almost acute life-threatening concerns. But you're really working with the stress around food. Binge eating is a big one that you're seeing. So maybe speak about that. Like, what is coming into your clinic these days?
So a lot right now, and definitely since the pandemic as well, I'm just seeing a lot more like emotional eating and binge eating disorder, and people just being fed up with the way that they interact with food is making them feel, whether it's from restricting, like feeling like it's really taking over their life. And of course, like with the pandemic, I think what's happened, and a lot of these things have been going on. Most of my patients who come in, it's like been 20 years, at minimum 10 years of this happening and being a huge part of their life. But I think what's happened in the pandemic is because it's forced people to have a lot more time with themselves. And so these patterns that have maybe been going on for so long have suddenly been there, all those distractions, whether it's been work or going out with friends or whatever, they're slipping away. And so instead we're left with how we're coping on a daily basis. And for some people, it's getting to the point where that is making their lives a lot harder.
Mm.
So that's a lot of what I'm seeing right now is people who are just like, I cannot go on like this anymore.
Mm.
It's actually what I think of as the most challenging part of any eating disorder, because it's invisible to most people. So with the low weight, especially in like anorexia, it's a very visible eating disorder. And at the beginning of that treatment, it's very clear the goal is to get the person back to a healthy weight where they can function and their life isn't in danger.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but once that happens, the treatment doesn't end. But that's kind of where it does in a lot of different cases. I feel like, okay, your weight restored, or even the same with like a binge eating disorder or an overeating or something. It's like the same, okay, well, you're now in a healthy weight, like everything's better. But in fact, this is the time when you are in that range of like, you're more physically stable, normally still not feeling good because your body is very kind of out of balance from everything that's going on and the way you're manipulating food. And then those thoughts are even worse because you haven't actually looked at why the eating disorder is there in the first place.
Right.
Because in a sense, it's just a coping mechanism.
Right.
It's much easier to focus on food than maybe how worthless we're feeling, on the rejection that's coming up, on the anxiety or on the depression, on how unsafe we feel at home, how stupid we feel in our jobs, whatever it is that's coming up that doesn't necessarily have a reason, but like these feelings that we have about ourselves, focusing on food is way easier.
Mm.
And you have to eat every day. So it's something that is there. Like it is something that you can focus on every day to escape, in a sense, from the real things that are underlying in your life.
Mm.
And so when you're at a place where your weight or your body does not feel good for the eating disorder, it can be debilitating because it exacerbates all of those, it exacerbates that coping. All of a sudden you're in a place where you can't use the same strategies, restriction, binge eating, whatever that you did before, but you are like, all of those things are still there, all of the eating thoughts are still there. And it can be what I think is like the most exhausting and debilitating phase of an eating disorder and the most invisible. I think that's the place where people don't know what to do and they don't know where to get help. And so that's like a lot of what I try and focus on right now, because it is one of the places that needs like the most support, both for the individual, but also it is the place that doesn't have support in terms of like different treatment centers and resources out there.
Mm-hmm. It's so many good points, because so first of all, this idea that weight restoration, so first of all, the focus on weight as the measure of whether someone's healed or not, already like we can see that that's problematic, because the focus is on weight and that's maybe where it was initially, and again as more of a superficial thing, as a way to control these deeper feelings. So now we've just got the healthcare team on board to focus on weight. Then there's this other idea of like weight restoration doesn't necessarily indicate, especially for low body weight restoration doesn't necessarily indicate health, right? Because that person may need to overshoot to replenish resources and things that were depleted. And then this other thing of like, okay, so we've stopped maybe the restriction or the behavior, but the underlying cause and the attitude and the feelings associated with it are still running rampant, and no one's really examining that stuff. And the person's kind of left feeling like, now you've taken away my coping mechanism and I'm still left with the feelings of worthlessness or incompetence or whatever was triggering these behaviors in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. So they have all of those feelings, and now they're in a body where that eating disorder voice is like so incredibly unhappy or feels bad or is telling them that it's wrong. And that is like completely overwhelming in so many different ways. Because you have the original, exactly as you said, like the original, whatever was going on, which was debilitating enough that they needed a coping mechanism. And now they're in a space where that coping mechanism is hurting them more.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is exhausting and it is excruciating
Mm-hmm.
from a mental, emotional perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Plus whatever is happening physiologically, because we are using a food to cope. And so that is going to have different impacts on the way our body functions. And sometimes it won't necessarily feel good. And that then can create a whole other layer to what's going on, because if it's painful to eat, it's going to make it harder. Even if that pain is caused by the mental emotional patterns that are going on, it's still going to make it harder to eat.
Mm-hmm. Right, because we're combining the physical sensation of fullness or hunger with the mental emotional, and then I've had many patients actually with binge eating disorder, emotional eating, who that feeling of fullness is so shame inducing. And so it's this physical sensation that's eliciting or worsening all of these symptoms. And yeah, you're right. It's so multi-layered, you know?
So is, and that's kind of, so like in my practice and like how I treat, there's kind of like 5 pillars is what I go on. One is first and foremost, just acknowledging what's happening with food, like that relationship with food and how it's impacting their life on a daily basis. Because first and foremost, we need to manage that, because when that relationship is so intense, mental, emotionally, it's like your body is in a perpetual panic without you even realizing it. Because every time you eat is triggering, or every time you don't eat is triggering, which takes its toll just from a physical perspective when you're that stressed out all the time, just because of what's happening internally. So like first is actually like looking at the food and treating that just to help manage on a daily basis. Then there's looking at what's going on underneath the food, like why, and it kind of goes back to like when this developed, why did it develop in the first place? How is this pattern with food manifesting in other parts of your life? Like what is really at the core of what's going on and how you feel about yourself. And then there's like managing what's happening physiologically. One, from helping to support digestion, so that you are able to eat foods and feel okay, and supporting those different hunger and fullness cues, because those can also get really, really skewed. A lot of my eating disorder patients will lose their hunger cues. So they actually don't know when they're hungry or when they're full, which really just perpetuates this entire cycle. Because it can feel like they're overeating or undereating no matter what.
Yeah, there's actually, I don't know what she is, but her name is Tabitha Farrar. I don't know if you've, yeah. And she talks about mental hunger in eating disorder recovery. So she's like, the body needs to expend energy to generate the physiological sensation of hunger. It's like gastric motility is involved, or different hormonal states. And when your body's depleted, it's not necessarily going to send you those signals. So, or it's kind of like when we always learn in ND school, a lot of chronic constipation comes from ignoring or repressing bowel movements. So the body kind of just gives up. And the body says, well, if you're not going to have a bowel movement, I'm not going to bother you with the sensation to have one. And so I think the same thing can apply to that physical hunger. And so it might show up in a different way in some people. And we think like mental hunger is emotional eating, or it's not real hunger. But according to Tabitha Farrar, like it's just as real as physiological hunger. Maybe that's your cue to eat, and it might feel like you're eating a lot. But yeah, so that's really interesting when you're like trying to reconnect the brain and the stomach again.
Yeah, it's exactly. It's like everything that's happening, like in this demographic, everything that's happening, whether physical or mental, emotional, like there's some type of purpose. And a lot of them are very painful for the person to experience, because they're not necessarily feelings that they want to have. And so it's working with those different things. And then even beyond digestion, like supporting exactly hormones going back into balance, as well as like our nervous system. Those are two things especially that in eating disorders are often compromised or depleted, or just out of balance as your body is trying to cope with everything that's going on inside of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then kind of the last thing is like this long-term support, because, and more often, because eating disorders are a daily struggle for people. Unfortunately, fortunately and unfortunately, we have to eat every day, 3 times a day. And so it's not like another type of coping mechanism, such as alcoholism, where you can be like, I'm never going to drink again. Like you can put it to the side, and it's just as hard and just as painful, but you have that ability to never engage with it if you don't want to. We don't have that with food and in eating disorders. So it is, when people are in recovery, it is a constant triggering, in the sense that it can be every time they eat, every time they think about food, and that can be all day if that's what it is. And so it's something that can fluctuate also during times of stress, all throughout our different lives. And it's kind of naive to believe that we can just give, one treatment and then you're going to feel so much better.
Right.
Because it's so much more complex and influenced by all of these different external things in our lives. So definitely making sure that we do offer that like long-term support, so that people know, and educating them on this can come, like things can get bad again. And it does not mean that you've taken a step back. It does not mean that the eating disorder is back, but our body remembers the ways that we've coped in the past. And when our nervous system gets overwhelmed and it can't cope, it will go back unconsciously to those things. And that's okay. But each time it happens, it opens up for a new layer of like healing and transcending this pattern to take place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that, because I think we can think, or maybe we've been conditioned to think that relapse means we're back to square one. And in every addiction model or recovery model, relapse is part of the cycle of healing. And we actually, I think, call it prolapse. I don't know if prolapse is the right word.
I don't know.
When your organs fall out of your body, but it was trying to frame it as something that's still moving you forward. And because, even like if a patient's trying to quit smoking, and I'll always, and I'm sure you do this too, is like really pick apart past attempts. Because they're like, oh, well, I quit for like 2 years, but then I went back. You're like, okay, but let's get into those 2 years. For 2 years, you were engaging in your preferred relationship with the substance or your preferred behavior. And so what was working about that? What didn't work? And you can really pick that apart to learn. So I love this idea of, yeah, things might get triggered again, but you've learned a ton of things and you're not going to start again. It doesn't make any sense that you would start again.
Exactly. I love that. And that is like exactly what I tell my patients. We focus on like the baby wins, like the little things that they do every day, or a couple times a week, that go against what maybe this eating disorder or what their pattern has been. Because each time you do something, no matter how small, like you're learning, you're breaking that hold that food has over you. You're reminding yourself that voice telling you that you're not worth it, even though it feels so true, it's wrong. And in this moment, this is why. But it's not this all or nothing approach that society kind of has projected that we need to do to heal. Eating disorder and a lot of different mental health conditions actually that doesn't work. And it can set the tone for failure or people not even trying because they're like, it's not worth it. But that isn't how healing actually takes place. It's like, it's showing up every day, even if, you binged again last night. It's like, that's okay. Being aware that happened, it's like, we can look at why it happened. Like, it opens the door to you learning so much more about yourself.
Mm.
And that's what I always tell my patients. I'm like, it is okay if all you can do right now is notice these patterns, notice what you're doing. You don't need to change them today. But but now that you've noticed them, you have it set the foundation for you to change them as you're able.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's a really good point, because we, acknowledging that that's your first pillar, but that's also, the first step. It's like, what is the thought that's coming into your head? What are you feeling in your body, the emotions? And we don't want typically to spend a lot of time in noticing, because it can feel really terrible when you're like, oh, this is what I'm thinking. This is a terrible thing. We can judge that. We can judge the feelings. But if we just examine with curiosity, it gives us a lot of space to then change. But it's that intermediate step it's like looking under the carpet at all the dust and crap that's under there and being like, I'm going to have to clean it. And it's like, well, just look at it first before we reach for the stuff to clean it. Just
Exactly. And that, I think, though, is the reason why a lot of people do not get support, and they live kind of in these painful patterns, because transcending them and noticing them is painful. It is not easy to have every fiber in your body being like, I need to restrict, and you not restricting.
right.
It is painful to go against what it's saying. And then, like you even mentioned, sometimes our body needs to overshoot in order to actually heal. So it can sometimes result in changes in how we perceive ourselves, possible changes in weight, up or down or staying the same, that like can be quite overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't mean that we're getting worse or that things are getting worse. It actually means the exact opposite, that our body's healing. But it can be painful enough that people choose to live in these patterns that are causing them to feel so bad, even though by getting that support and acknowledging those things and looking at them, like, there's so much light on the other side of that. But it's scary.
Mm-hmm. It really is. Yeah. And I'm just thinking about trauma and how we, develop coping skills, whether it be, patterns with food or something else that just helped us get through a really difficult time, and are maybe helping us get through a current time. And then when you start to remove those coping mechanisms, and also are exposing, like you just mentioned, the intense fear, like we're realizing the fear, right? So if the fear is around gaining weight, and now you're saying not only do you need to gain the weight back to what we're telling you is what you should be, but even maybe way more, that could be extremely triggering. And to have faith in the process that it'll all work out, and that this is the right thing, and that it's I'm also just imagining so your first pillars are just like, how do we navigate food? Like, you still have to eat. So while we're healing, you're still interacting with this thing that's triggering you. And you're going to like barbecues, and you're also exposed to diet culture, and even people who are well-intentioned, who are giving you advice around food on your Instagram accounts and whatever. And it's like, how do we even know what the right thing is? Like, if everybody's eating chips and pizza, and you're like, well, that's not really healthy, but I'm also not supposed to be restricting, and that's all there. It's so complicated. So yeah.
It is like very multi-layered, and it is very debilitating for the person who's experiencing it, because it's like this constant, like it is constant. Exactly like you said, like being in social situations, like food is such an integral part of not just our survival, but also just our social culture. Like, it's so much more than that. And as we kind of mentioned, like, most people have some type of stress around food. It can be really small, whatever. But food has become I'm going to say, safe way for people to project their stress on other people. Like you all of the time, you know, someone's on the internet or like you said on Instagram, or someone's trying to give you advice and they're like, this is what you should be doing. Like, this is the way you're supposed to be eating and blah, 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 blah. Or this is the best diet, or this is bad and this is good, and whatever. But it's different for every person. Like, there is no right way to eat. There is no, like, no two people are going to be the same in what they need or how they metabolize food or how they feel. And that is like a constant judgment and projection in society. So when you already, like when you're someone who has like an actual eating disorder, not just some stress around food, but an actual eating disorder, and you have all of this judgment on yourself and this like turmoil going on inside of you, then to have other people, even just someone commenting on what you're eating, even saying like, oh wow, what a good plate of food, or did you get enough? Like, even if it's not projecting their own stresses onto you, like that can be like over the edge.
Right. Just a neutral comment could be extremely triggering, or just, you look healthy today, you have strong legs, or some comment about your body or your food.
Exactly. Even something like, you look beautiful, you look good. But that meaning for them, when they hear it, could be something like, oh my God, you've gained so much weight. You look amazing. I'm so happy you're at this weight. Like, it's so much better. Like, there is a whole narrative that comes from these comments that no matter how well-intentioned they are.
Yeah. It's also like, I mean, I'm just even thinking too, like, so our years of nutritional training, how we interact with food, and I can still look at an Instagram feed where they talk about intermittent fasting or plant-based diet, and I can still find myself swayed in that direction. Like, maybe I should do more intermittent fasting. And it's like, no, Talia, you have tried this and it didn't work for you. Like, you gave it a shot. So even this internal compass, our own experience, our own knowledge, our understanding that it's different for everyone, it's the images and the messaging is so potent. It's so difficult. And if it's a big struggle that someone is actively trying to heal from, I can't imagine how difficult it must be to stay the course, you know, and to stay grounded in it and committed to what that person needs to do to heal. And then also the journey towards healing is not necessarily clear, right? Like,
exactly,
what is the relationship with food that we're aiming for? It's different for every single person. So yeah.
It is. And that's also what I talk with like a lot of my patients. And always one of the things that we're kind of aiming towards, it isn't like there's a specific end or a specific way that things are going to look in the end, but it's always to decrease the power that food has on your life, because it is controlling their life and dictating how they feel about themselves. And food doesn't actually have that power. Having a piece of chocolate cake does not say anything about your worth as a human being. It does not change who you are. It does not change how great of a person you are. It will not change your weight, in fact, one piece of chocolate cake. And so, but for many, many people, that piece of chocolate cake, and it doesn't actually matter what the food is, but that can have, for people, it's olive oil. Having olive oil can have all of these things associated with it, all of this meaning that is not true. And that's part of what a lot of the goal, like with that relationship with food, beyond what's happening underneath, but with that actual like relationship, is making it so that food doesn't dictate who you are or your worth. And whether or not you choose to eat chocolate cake or avocados or carrots, whatever it is, it's knowing, like on a regular basis, it's knowing that if you do have them, it is okay. Like, it's okay. It's not changing anything. And so it's this freedom with food, in the sense that like you can go to a barbecue and have chips and pizza and be like, that's okay. Today I had chips and pizza, and maybe tonight I'll have something else.
Mm-hmm.
because this is one meal on one day, and we have to have hundreds and hundreds of meals in a year. So is this one meal really going to do anything?
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Actually, it's really super nuanced as I'm listening, because I'm thinking of, okay, so there's so many things going on, right? Like you can have chips and pizza and not feel great physically. But it's sort of this idea of like, when I when I go to the gas station and pick the cheapest food to put in my car or the cheapest fuel, like it's a no brainer. I'm always going to pick the cheapest because gasoline is gasoline according to me, and it has no connection to my worth or how I feel about myself. And if somebody like a mechanic was like, oh, you know what, your car for these reasons needs the better gasoline, I could just make that decision. I might feel a little bit bad or guilty if I didn't do it, like, but it would be related to my car. So it still has an emotional tone, but it's not about my worth. And I think what you're speaking to is like, there's going to be these impacts of food no matter what, because it's so nuanced. And this is someone who's um trying to shift this relationship, but it doesn't have to like ruin your day. Like
Mm-hmm.
if I put crap gasoline in my car, I'm not like driving, like it's not affecting the rest of my day type thing. But sometimes that chocolate cake can ruin someone's day. And mhm.
Exactly. And for any person, food does not have that power that we give to it. It doesn't. There is no, chocolate cake is chocolate cake.
Mhm.
And you know what? It has sugar in it, which is going to give us energy. It has chocolate, which has some antioxidants. It's got some carbohydrates, which is going to fuel our body. There are, yes, it might not be, like you said, like the best fuel,
Mhm.
but it's not like the evil that it's been created. And so that is so much of healing that relationship with food, is just being able to accept it for what it is and not judge it and not apply any meaning to it. And sure, maybe you eat the chocolate cake and you don't feel great. Like maybe you actually are like, oh, that didn't really like make me feel that good. That's okay. It still doesn't mean anything. It just means that, okay, maybe today that wasn't what your body wanted. That's okay. You had it anyways. That's okay. You know why you're feeling this way. It will pass,
Yep.
because it's just a piece of cake that your body's now going to process, digest, eliminate.
Mhm.
And then maybe next time you're like, oh, maybe I don't want the chocolate cake. Maybe I'm going to have like the apple instead.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
it's all about decreasing that power that food has. And true healing, like from an eating disorder, is being able to do that, to make choices, and based on, not based on your worth and the food, but being able to kind of eat everything when you want to or when you need to, without it influencing like you from a mental emotional perspective.
Mhm.
And most people, regardless of whether they have an eating disorder or not, cannot do that.
Mhm. Mhm. No, that's true. Even if someone wouldn't identify or be diagnosed by anyone with an eating disorder, like food has this power over us generally. Like for most people, I think it's very rare to meet someone who really does see it as just like, oh, what kind of gasoline I put in my car kind of thing. Um, and and I love that you're saying like it's not going to make or break your weight or anything, any of that stuff, even your health. So even if you're supposed to be not consuming gluten, it's not going to ruin whatever you're trying to achieve health wise either. So it really is just this chocolate cake and it doesn't say anything about anything. It doesn't contain any meaning. Um, but we give it so much meaning. And then there's this other aspect, which is body size, which I think we've kind of collapsed the two, but I think they can be separate because someone can have a stressful relationship with food and not really be concerned too much with body size. And the opposite can be true. Someone can look like their eating habits are pretty like quote unquote healthy and then be really troubled by body size. And maybe you can speak a bit to that of like body image and yeah.
Definitely. And so body image, basically, like just kind of to define it for people is our perception of ourselves. So it is not like, body image is not weight. It is not like necessarily how we physically look, but it's the image that we have of ourselves. So our body image, the way we see ourselves, can actually be very, very different than how we look in reality or how other people see us. And that is a huge part. That's actually a huge part, not just of eating disorders, but for a lot of different people, because it's influenced by our view, how we think about ourselves, the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, about what we're supposed to look like, these expectations. And so when we look in the mirror, often the person looking back at us is not what someone else would see when they looked at us. And so this kind of speaks exactly. And so this like disconnect between what you actually look like in reality and what you see yourself as is body dysmorphia. And this is exactly what you kind of spoke to, is this stress around food. Some people, they can see themselves exactly as they don't have that dysmorphic body image. And so the food isn't necessarily about, like, their stress around food isn't about like their body. It can be like completely unrelated. Whereas a lot of people, no matter what their weight is, they don't see that, or the feeling, like how they feel in their body makes them look different. For example, like anorexia is one of the disorders that has the most prevalent body dysmorphia, in the sense that with restriction, the goal isn't always to lose weight, even though that's a byproduct. And even I'll talk to any of my restrictive or anorexic patients, and I'm like, okay, so what's the number that ideally you want to get to? And there isn't. And so they'll say it, and I'll be like, okay, will you be happy at that number? No, because it isn't even actually about the number. Because what they see when they look in the mirror, like, they don't see a thin person. Like, they look much, much bigger, and they feel much, much bigger than what's looking back at them. And so it isn't about how they're able, like what number to get to or whatever, but it's like just keeping that scale going down is making them feel better about this body image that's going on, versus because they just can't see themselves properly.
Yeah, it's even in just the downward trajectory feels, and I think we spoke earlier about the sense of control and how it's helping cope with deeper feelings of worthlessness. So it's not really about even the body image, but that's how that's the trouble that's manifesting, or the pain point. Yeah,
exactly. And a lot of it comes down to is like really looking at, okay, so why is it so important for the scale to keep going down? Or what is bad about being a certain weight? Or like really breaking down these things that have so much meaning and like are so panic inducing. And it's like, why is this a bad thing? Like really making them question why these things are deemed bad. And a lot of our discussions like is with my patients is like, they'll say it loud and they're like, that does not make sense what I just said out loud, but like it feels so true. They're like, I can see telling you that like that does not make sense, but it doesn't matter, because like that feeling overrides. And that's why also the consistent support is so important, because it's like a lot of my patients will leave our sessions and they're like, okay, like I get it. But when those feelings, those physical sensations, like those thoughts, like they're so overpowering and they feel so true, that it's, even though logically a part of them can be like, I know it's impossible that I've gained 10 pounds in 1 week. Like I know it's impossible with everything that I've been doing, but like it doesn't feel real. And I see myself and I see that. even if it's not there, even if they've lost weight, it's like those feelings are so intense that their body image, they see the opposite of what's happening. And it's like a constant, like it's literally constantly retraining. And that's why like that consistent support is so, so important.
Yeah.
It's like a constant battle.
Yeah, because what you're just speaking to is this idea of like showing cognitive dissonance. So it's like I these two things can't be true. I can't have gained 10 pounds but then be the same, or even deeper than that, the 10 pounds doesn't mean that I'm a worthless person. And I can believe that, but the other thing I also believe. So when you hold those two things, there needs to be a resolution. So by continuing to bring up the logical piece of like that it gets stronger and it starts to dissolve the other piece. But because there's so much emotional weight to these deeper belief systems, even the fact that you ask is so interesting, right? Because a lot of people who, especially steeped in diet culture, it's like, well, of course weight loss is good. I've never been asked to question that. We've been told repeatedly, the messaging is consistently telling us that weight loss is good and thin is good. And so why would you even question why it's important for me to? So just by asking that and digging into values and deeper belief systems is like, could probably, it might be even hard for a lot of your patients to access those answers too, I imagine.
It definitely is. And so it's a lot of planting the seed and then following up like every visit. Like I normally do like bi-weekly visits especially at the beginning, and it's like planting the seed, and then even the next time, a lot of times like haven't been able to go there, but it's there because it isn't about them coming to an answer. It isn't even about them necessarily like I don't need an answer from them. Like it's for them, and I'm just here to support and help them untangle what's going on because there's so much. Yeah. And when it's all happening inside of you, it's very hard to navigate it yourself, especially when there's also this delusion with body or how you look or what you're eating. Like so much of it isn't based in reality and it's based on feelings. So it can feel like even a lot of my patients who come in and they're like, I'm binge eating. They're not. They're eating, they're exercising insane amounts. Like they need that amount of food. It is not a binge, but it feels like it to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually very common. I'm as I think of my practice, the conception of what is actually, what are we talking about when we're talking about binge, right? Because a lot of it is just you're eating in response to the requirements of your body for energy, and your body's just not letting you control. Maybe some of us, like I was thinking about this for like some of us are maybe genetically hardwired or just hormonally hardwired in some way for the body to override our attempts to restrict. And I don't want to make this like a willpower thing. It's like willpower is not part of it. It's the body can sometimes just force, or the thoughts can be so obsessive, and the body's need for energy can just kind of overpower our like ability to repress it or whatever we're trying to do. I'm that way for sure. Like I was trying to do a fast because I heard it's good for me. And my body would just like, it's like, no, you are going to be obsessed with food and you're going to eat. And that feeling can be really troublesome when you have other plans. But then when you look at it, it's like, it's not a binge. You're just eating. Your body's just trying to get fed.
Exactly. 100%. And if you are planning to restrict, and fasting is just a form of restriction, which is why I'm always also careful with intermittent fasting, because some people just do it because it's a way to restrict. But that's a whole other can of worms. Yeah. But when you have a plan to restrict and then you eat even a normal amount of food, it feels like a binge because that was not in the plan. So it feels out of control. And the main sensation with when people think of binging is out of control eating. So it doesn't necessarily, the amount is irrelevant. It's more like the feelings that go with it. So even like for you, it probably felt like you're like, oh my gosh, I'm eating so much.
Mhm.
But it was just because your plan had been to not eat anything because you were on a fast.
Yeah, it was just normal. It was, my body's like, we're not doing this. This is stupid.
Yeah,
Why would we be fasting? It's like, oh, fasting's so good for us. It's like, well, why would we do this when there are cupcakes? Like, we don't want to do this.
exactly. And that is, I'm actually so glad that you brought that point up because it is a huge part of any kind of eating disorder. And it's often why often people who are anorexic, years later, when they've recovered, they will go the opposite way. And for them, they're so overwhelmed and confused, but it is literally their body, and that ability to restrict is kind of gone. But it's literally their body is like, I cannot do that anymore. I was so exhausted. It took so much mental energy for me to be in that restrictive state that I can't. And they end up what feels like uncontrollable eating. And sometimes it definitely is a binge, and sometimes it's just very different than what they're used to.
Mm.
But this binge restrict cycle, it is so common, and true healing with food cannot happen until we can transcend this binge restrict cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And even just in stress with food, like even in just normal, like for everyone, people who don't really have a dysfunction with food, like that is even common. Like intermittent fasting is a type of binge restrict.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying it's good or bad or anything, but it's saying you can't eat for these 16 hours and then you need to eat your whole day's worth of food in these 4 hours or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
That is a type of binging and restricting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And and even in binge eating disorder, they often will do a type of intermittent fasting, not even intentionally, but when they have a binge the night before, they don't want to eat the next day until kind of the next evening when they want to binge again. But in doing that, you almost set yourself up for another binge because all day your body's been deprived. And so now this is where like also balancing physiologically comes in. Like now your blood sugar is out of whack, your energy is really low, your body is craving, like it needs something because it hasn't had food. So it's craving sugar, easy energy, carbs. And once we get into that state, it takes longer for the fullness to register because your body's kind of like, oh my gosh, when are you feeding me again? Give me more food, give me more food.
Mm-hmm.
Every time we restrict to compensate for a binge, we're perpetuating that entire cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And until just in general, we can like transcend that pattern, be like, one of the things I tell my patients with binge eating disorder is you need to eat 3 times per day. These are the times, like often we start with kind of like a schedule just to, because our bodies need to be retrained.
Right. Mm-hmm. That retraining process. Yeah.
Exactly. And I'm like, if you binge, it's irrelevant to these 3 times that you're eating.
Mm-hmm.
These happen. If you binge, it's extra. It doesn't impact, like this is your medicine right now.
Mm-hmm.
Because it can be so challenging, especially at the beginning, because especially with body image and weight, it's like, well, why would I eat more when I binge? But it isn't about that. Like this is about supporting your body, and by creating this routine and retraining your body that food is coming at regular intervals, and there are these blood sugar balancing meals throughout the day, that's when we can start to not physiologically need the binge as much.
Mm-hmm.
So when we can balance that physiological part of it, it gets easier to focus on now the mental emotional part of the binge, because you don't have the two of them like colliding and causing this kind of chaos
Yeah.
in your mind.
Yeah, I really like that you brought that up, because I think so many patients will come in to see me and they're like, I emotionally eat at night. And then we actually do an inventory and find out that they're undernourishing hardcore during the day. Like there's a major deficit in the earlier parts of the day when they're expending all their energy. And so I look at it as the compensation of the body, like we discussed, trying to get the energy requirements it needs. But then there could be this feeling of being out of control because it's more than what they planned.
Exactly.
But then often when we say, okay, like we do our regular blood sugar stuff, breakfast in the morning, support the regular meal intervals, making sure there's protein, fats, fiber at every meal, that kind of thing, all our basic stuff, that often the binge eating or quote emotional eating goes away. So it's not that that's the only cause of it, but the cycle perpetuates when we get caught in this thing of, well, I'm not going to eat breakfast because I ate too much last night. And it just, again, like you said, feeds the cycle of feeling like we're eating emotionally or out of control. And it's like your body's just trying to get the food it needs, you know?
Exactly. And then once and like you said, like it often can just get less once we do those basic things. And then it can become more of a choice.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to emotional eat at night, then you can choose to. And that's okay, because it is okay to actively choose sometimes to do these things.
Mm-hmm.
Like it is okay. It's when it's controlling your life and making you feel bad and impacting your health, that's when it's not okay.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
It's
sometimes peanut butter ice cream makes things better, right?
exactly. And like that is totally okay. It's also just like accepting that. It's like, okay, well, you know what? Today I really want to have the peanut butter chocolate ice cream tonight, and being okay with it. It's the same thing I tell my patients, even like irrelevant of eating disorders. Like if someone comes in for digestive concerns or there's some other reason and they're trying to figure out like maybe a food trigger or something like that. And they realize that, oh, I actually, you know, when I eat dairy, I get like an acne flare up or whatever it is. That's power for them. So they can still eat dairy. That's totally fine.
Yeah, eat it every day, eat it every meal.
Exactly. But then when they get the acne flare up, they know why, and that they can still choose it to do it. And there's no judgment, and you can totally do it. But then at least you know, and the option is yours.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like the same with the binging. It's like if you set the foundation so that your body is nourished and balanced during the day, and you want to, you know, have a bag of chips while you watch TV at night, you can choose to do that. But it's not like you have to do it. It's not like you're being controlled by your physiological processes and your mental emotional processes. It's like you're like, nope, tonight I just feel like it, so I'm going to do it.
Yeah. And I think like just back to this idea of willpower, just touch on it. I think the research is showing that willpower is more about blood sugar than anything else. Even in
Definitely.
making decisions for food unrelated things. Like I think they've looked at Israeli judges and the decisions they made in the morning when their blood sugar was stable versus at 4 p.m. when they needed a snack. And everyone, they doled out harsher punishments later on.
That is actually so fascinating, and I totally believe it.
Isn't that crazy? And then they gave them snacks, and there was more consistency in the crime and what the sentence was.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So this idea that we're like, oh, I can, you know, at 4 p.m. I want donuts and I'm just going to force myself to not. It's like, no, you're hungry. It's 4 p.m. You're hungry. Have a snack. You know?
Exactly. There's this, even what you brought up, like this cognitive dissonance. It's like our brain has these expectations of what we're supposed to do, irrelevant of our body's functioning, irrelevant of our body's needs, and it can override like what our body needs. Where you said it's like, oh my gosh, it's 4 p.m. I am craving a donut because I just need a snack of something. So instead, I'm going to give my body nothing because I shouldn't be having that donut. I shouldn't be having a snack. I've eaten too much, blah, 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 blah. The narrative goes on and on and on. Whereas it's actually literally just your body telling you that, like, I need something. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, food has got all of this meaning attached to it, but it's really just nourishment. Like, we need food to survive. Mm-hmm. And like that's it. That's all that it is. Yeah. But over the years, we've attached all of this different meaning and associations to food, and given it this story that most of us don't even remember why what food is for in the first place.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, it's like it seems to just be like something that I try and eat as little of as possible because it makes me a good person or an on, on point or in control. And you're like, no, it's not what it was for. My dog Coco doesn't think of food that way.
Oh my gosh. My dog Shelby either. She's a French bulldog and I've never seen someone eat faster. Like her whole day is made when I feed her. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, he doesn't care about the calories in the dead fish he ate on the ground. He's like, this is delicious and fermented. I'm gonna eat the whole thing and growl at you. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but we again, like we're an animal that's been conditioned to, like you said, connect it to deeper things, to heal wounds with it, and to manage really deep, painful feelings with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us back to where we started with this idea of the getting deeper beyond the layers of, and we also, before recording, we're talking about how naturopathic, really whatever you focus on as an ND in someone's health, can be a gateway to accessing these deeper things, as long as you're working with someone that's willing to do that with you. If you come in with like cardiovascular disease prevention, you can still get to these feelings of worth and shame or whatever it is that might be driving maybe behaviors that are working against you in terms of healing, but maybe even just how our body and our stress response, interacts with these feelings and all these components. So, yeah.
Exactly. Like that is what I love about our profession is we have these tools to go deeper, to look at the body as a whole, to look at our mind, to look at how they're connected, and then support that whole thing.
This is so
It's
great, Alexandra. Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a unique position, but that's what I love about it.
Yeah, me too. I love that it's like this really dynamic. Yeah, there's certain personalities where you're like, this is really the only job I could do because I need to just invent my life every day.
Yeah, exactly.
like, oh yeah, we can do acupressure. Like we can, yeah. Like let's pull out this other tool I haven't used in a while, and then it works, and you're all excited. And yeah, it's a great medicine. It's a great profession. But any last thoughts or any last take homes that you want to share?
I guess kind of like my biggest thing is just for anyone who is struggling with food or an eating disorder and feeling like trapped in that, is that it doesn't have to be that way. And there are resources out there, and it's definitely just like finding someone who you can connect with, who can kind of hold that space for you, and someone who understands, because there are a lot of different practitioners out there who are amazing, but they don't have that kind of knowledge of eating disorders or how to support it, and they might actually just be perpetuating what's going on. And that doesn't mean that you're never going to feel better. If you're working with someone who is trying to help you, but it's not necessarily the right support, like it does not mean that there's no hope, because there always is. And these are patterns, like it is possible to get through them and to feel better.
Mm-hmm. This is wonderful. Yeah. Even in working with the person who might inadvertently be triggering some things, it might bring it to the surface that this is something that needs to take priority as well. So if someone's giving you a diet diary, let's say, and it's creating these feelings, that might be an opportunity then to seek out someone who's more focused in eating disorders and relationship with food.
Exactly.
Mm.
And yeah.
Yeah, this is so great. Where can people find you, Alexandra? So yeah.
Okay, so right now I'm working at the Arenda Clinic, which is at Gerrard and Broadview in Toronto. And so I'm there 3 days a week, either for virtual or online appointments. And so all of my information is either at my website, which is alexandrasisamnd.com, or at the Arenda Clinic website as well. And then my email is also on both of those, and people can reach out to me directly. They can call the clinic if they have any questions or concerns, or just want to talk. I do like free 15 minutes, anything like that. I am on Instagram, alexandrasisam.nd as well.
Yeah, and we'll put all that stuff in the show notes so people can reach out to you, find you, follow you. your Instagram account's great. I love your posts. You have a lot of really insightful things that you're sharing. So people can
Thank
hopefully,
you.
find you. And this was so great. Thank you so much for joining me.
No problem. Thank you for having me. I also love your Instagram as well. I especially love the one about coffee yesterday.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was like I drink coffee and then I do the things. I'm like,
Yeah,
and then
exactly.
I drink another coffee.
I was like, yep, that was me this morning.
Yeah, the coffee is my super fuel. It's
Great.
yeah, exactly. No shame in that.
Oh no, no regrets at all.